Well, hi there. My name is Jonathan Cardin, and I am the Director of Major Gifts here at Patrick Henry College. And today I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Marvin Olasky and Dr. Al Mohler. Dr. Olasky is a professor of journalism here, and he holds the Distinguished Chair of Journalism here on campus. Many of you probably know him better as the editor-in-chief of World Magazine. Dr. Olasky and his wonderful wife, Susan, have become prized fixtures here on campus, thanks in no small part to this very Newsmaker Interview Series. It's been wonderful having thought leaders from various arenas here on campus, and I know it's been a blessing, in particular, to the students. Today, Dr. Olasky will be interviewing Dr. Al Mohler, who is the president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Dr. Mohler is certainly a thought leader of the evangelical movement. In fact, Time magazine called him the reigning leader of the intellectual movement, or sorry, the reigning intellectual of the evangelical movement. So needless to say, we're blessed to have him, and I think we're all looking forward to hearing this interview. So thank you very much. Welcome to campus, and please welcome Dr. Olasky and Dr. Al Mohler.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for coming, and I can offer as an unsolicited testimonial that just about every day I listen to Dr. Mohler's briefing, which is about a 20-minute analysis of the news, and really great stuff. It sounds wonderful. It sounds as if it's all written out, but it's not. You're actually just talking, which amazes me, because I talk, and just about everyone talks in fits and spurts and broken sentences, and it comes out very fluently. I'm really impressed.
Thank you.
And listening to that, because you deal with lots of policy matters and theological issues, it might be that listeners think of you as a brain on a stick. But you're a real human being, as I'm finding out here. Yes, this is no. So tell us a little bit about growing up. I understand you grew up in Lakeland, Florida, spring training home of the Detroit Tigers.
Absolutely.
And what was it like growing up there?
You know, I grew up in an idyllic, middle-class Christian home. Loving mother and father. I was the firstborn of 4 kids. We were not at all wealthy. But as a kid, I didn't know that. My father was a grocery store manager, and I had the happiest childhood I could imagine, and I'm very thankful for that. It was a snapshot of American culture in the 1960s, and I realized, I was talking just recently to a group about how privileged I was to have known that world, because it no longer exists. But wonderful, happy church. I never went to anything but a public school from the 1st grade to the 12th grade. And in those early years, that public school was just an extension of home and an extension of church. And it's a very different world, but that's the world I knew as a boy. And a world in which my parents would have thought it completely safe, and they did think it was completely safe to let me loose on the world, you know, as a 10, 11, 12-year-old. In the entire neighborhood, or to send me to school or to the Boy Scouts or anything, because it was a very unified, safe world. That changed when I was a teenager. And we moved from Lakeland to Fort Lauderdale, the Broward County, Florida. And Marvin, I'll just tell you, that was a huge shock. That was a completely different world. And I had an apologetic crisis. Everything just all came at once when I was about 13, 14, 15, because I was wrenched out of a world that looked like a picture postcard of the safety of that kind of life in the 1960s, and I was thrown into a very different world.
So you're thrown into that world, and how do you react to it? Do you react to it with, gee, I want to escape from this, or were you able to enter into it in some way? And
well, I believe the Lord was using it in my life. It made my intellectual curiosity a matter of incredible urgency. And it was, I had an apologetic crisis really young. I had an 8th grade history teacher who declared himself to be an atheist and was foisting this. In the elementary school I'd gone to, all the teachers are members of our church or another church that we knew. It was inconceivable there would be a teacher being atheist and pushing this on 13 and 14-year-olds. And I did not have good answers. And that panicked me. And I believe the Lord is using that to make me an apologist. But it wasn't the way it felt when I was, 13, 14, 15 years old. But by God's grace, I ended up in some places, in some relationships where incredible Christian intellectual strength was poured into me. I was a believer, and I knew that was the difference between intellectual life and death, even as a teenager.
So as a teenager, what were those places and what were those relationships?
Well, the relationships were interesting. I had a wonderful youth pastor who really was not an apologist and didn't know much. He was a youth pastor that just graduated from college, and they hired him as a youth pastor. He could play the guitar and had a wife. That was a good deal. That's how you became a youth pastor back then. And he loved us.
Wife plus guitar.
That's right. Wife plus guitar plus college degree equals youth pastor. And never been arrested. That was, you had that one.
So.
And he loved us and loved us and loved us. He loved us in Christ, but he couldn't answer my questions, and I could tell I was panicking him. And to make a long story short, I ended up talking to a freshly minted seminary graduate of a different denomination. And when I would ask other people, other questions of Christians like this, they would panic. And I asked him questions. He said, "Oh man, that's exactly the right question." He said, this is exactly what we need to talk about. He had just graduated from Westminster Theological Seminary and was ready for a 15-year-old to show up panicked. And he introduced me to his senior pastor, who became a lifelong friend, Jim Kennedy, at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church. And Jim Kennedy was a natural-born apologist in terms of his ministry. A lot of people don't know that. But it was through Dr. Kennedy I got to know, the great influence of Francis Schaeffer in my life and so many others. And so I'm just so thankful in God's providence. I was led into health. There was a recent seminary graduate who had done his work in apologetics, just ready for me to show up.
Now, did you go to Jim Kennedy's church, Presbyterian church?
No, I was a Baptist.
Right.
I am a Baptist. And
I was suggesting possible heresy.
Well, no, I will simply say that as you know, I'm very reformed in my theology, as were the Baptist founders of our school and of the Southern Baptist Convention. But I'm a Baptist with a capital B, and in that sense, Baptists and Presbyterians, alike Orthodox in the faith, may be the last people who can have an honest disagreement about what to do with the baby. But we do so out of theological respect, and we share a theological heritage that is well explained historically and theologically. But Jim Kennedy became a lifelong friend, and he was a good friend of my pastor, the Baptist pastor. This was kind of the heyday of evangelicalism as a cultural movement in South Florida, which was a huge thing. Kind of like Southern California, there were two very interesting ecological subcultures of evangelicalism.
Okay, not to get into this specific theological issue, but I'll tell you, I'm about, when it comes to baptism, I'm about 51% Presbyterian and 49% Baptist. I can see the arguments on both sides. Are you 51-49 or are you 100-0?
When it comes to believer baptism, I am 100%. I would add to it if I could.
Okay. All right. And so, were your parents able to answer any of these questions? Did you ever discuss this with them? Or?
No. I did discuss it with them. I think I scared the daylights out of them. And they were just wonderful, loving Christian parents. And my father was a grocery store manager. He was also a man of ideas. He never dissuaded me from seeking to understand these things, and did his best to help to get me to places where that could happen. And I'm very thankful for that, because I think one of the things a lot of people don't know is how easily it is to crush, especially a young person, but for that matter, any person, but especially a young person, asking questions. If that's dismissed as subversive to the faith, if that's dismissed as something that is treasonous or wrong, that can have a crushing effect. Or if it is responded to with a kind of anxiety that implies I don't actually have an answer to this.
Mm-hmm. So when you go to college, then, are you already prepared for the type of stuff that's going to be thrown at you there?
I was. And what I thought would be thrown at me was exactly what was thrown at me, and that was actually a great intellectual crucible.
Did you talk back to the professors?
I did somewhat, although I was raised to be very respectful to authority, but I had some genuine intellectual engagements, and that's also when I discovered that And by the way, I would say that especially at that stage of my life, many of the people who helped me the most intellectually were unbelievers. One of the things I discovered is that great teachers really do love to teach. They really do love students who love to ask questions and love to be engaged in conversation. And so I discovered that they were not put off by this kind of question.
And college was where?
Well, it's complicated, but I began as a faculty scholar at Florida Atlantic University.
Okay.
So I entered college as a junior, and that was sociologically tough, but academically good. And the professors there had largely been recruited from the Northeast with the idea you come down and teach that you can retire in Boca Raton. And so there were wonderful, wonderful, headline professors from Northeastern universities who came down.
A very enticing thing in this winter with all the snow and cold.
Yes,
and so
indeed.
forth.
It turned out easy for the state of Florida to go recruit people in February in Boston. I then transferred, however, because I had a very clear sense at that stage of my life as an 18, 19-year-old of God's call to ministry. And I wanted to study what that university could not provide me. So I transferred to Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama.
Okay.
That was a different kind of challenge.
How was that a challenge?
Well, it was incredibly nurturing. The Samford experience for me, as I also met my wife there in a real sense. We were from the same hometown, but got to know each other in college. It was a wonderful experience. I hated to leave, but it was a baptism, in a sense, into all the theological foment and the theological controversies that would basically consume the rest of my life. It was a religion department pretty heavily invested in neo-orthodoxy, which I hardly understood as a category yet, but later came to see in terms of exactly what was being taught.
So as a young man in your 20s, I understand that you were in this foment, and
Yeah.
and Carl Henry helped to set you straight. Is that
Later.
Later.
When I was in college, I knew who he was. In fact, I got the first 2 volumes of God, Revelation, and Authority because, I don't know if you remember the old Word book club offered, if you sent in a card out of Christianity Today, you got the 2 volumes for 99 cents a piece, which Carl Henry later said made them the 2 most owned and least read volumes in evangelical history. But I had them, and I can still remember looking at them as a college student thinking, my goodness, he's going to write 6 of these. Later, he became not only a mentor, but a very dear friend. And that was especially when I was in seminary. Carl Henry was to me then what Francis Schaeffer had been when I was in high school.
so most owned, least read? In evangelical world, because generally in secular world it would be the memoirs of Bill and Hillary Clinton that are owned but not read. But moving beyond that, Carl Henry, I just got to tell you one Carl Henry story, because in his 80s, in the 1990s, he would start writing columns for World. He was a little bit sad about the movement of Christianity today, the theological movement, so he was writing for World, and I was very impressed to be receiving in the mail columns from the hugely distinguished Carl F.H. Henry. But there would be 3 pages typed, double-spaced, so easy to edit. And he enclosed, every time, a self-addressed stamped postcard. And on the back of the postcard, he had hand-drawn 2 little boxes, one accept, one reject. And he wanted to make it easy for me to do this. Now, you can imagine the trepidation with which I very occasionally had to reject a Carl Henry column. But I was so impressed with his humility.
He would have remembered that you did.
So, that he was doing that. As opposed to.
Well, of course, he started out his professional life, so to speak, as a secular journalist in Long Island, which is part of his story. I'll have to tell you that Carl Henry looms large in my life in every respect. I have on my desk right now a signed. I edited one of his books for him. I have a signed book and a signed photograph sitting on my desk at the moment. But he also humiliated me one time in the most helpful way. He was an agent of theological correction in my life. I was an inerrantist. I held to the faith once for all delivered to the saints. I was clearly a conservative evangelical, but as a young 20-something, I was an egalitarian. I had never confronted a real complementarian argument. Things like Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood hadn't been written yet. CBMW is located on our campus now, didn't exist yet. And I was
CBMW being the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, right?
That's right. And those arguments were not out there. And at college and in seminary, at a very liberal age at the seminary, all I'd been taught were egalitarian arguments, and they just made sense to me because I hadn't considered any other arguments. And I hadn't gotten to where I decided I was going to make that a major focus of theological issue yet. I was working on other things. And I was walking with Dr. Henry, and I was hosting him one time. I'm about 24 years old. And as we're walking along, he asked me, because he's always interrogating, he asked me, he said, "What's your position on this?" And I told him, and he just stopped. And he looked at me and said, "One day you're going to be very embarrassed to hold that position." And what you need to know is, as you can understand, when Carl Henry said that, that was the day you were very embarrassed to hold that position, because I realized instantly I've really not been a good thinker on this. And so that night, after I had taken Dr. Henry to the hotel, I went straight to the library and sought to find every single book I could find on that. Could find no complementarian arguments until I found one written by a charismatic Catholic.
Okay.
And I read it, and even that book had enough argument in the first 150 pages. I realized, oh my goodness, this was never consistent with what I believed, that is, the egalitarian position. And so the next morning, out of fear and trepidation, I just brought it up and said, I just want you to know I'm working on this. He said, "I knew you would."
So a man of enormous honesty and courage and humility.
And a great heart. People just, often when you read a man, you don't know the greatness of his heart. He had a great heart.
Yeah. So then, having been properly schooled at that point by Carl F. H. Henry and moving along, then at the amazingly young age of 33,
yes,
you become president of the flagship seminary of the Southern Baptist. Were you amazed by that? Did you expect that? It just seems so striking to me that age 33.
I don't think any sane person would expect that. It's explicable only under a very narrow set of circumstances which happen to pertain. The Southern Baptist Convention was going through an incredible period of theological revolution, what was called a conservative resurgence. Almost alone in the life of major denominations, had a conservative takeover of the mechanisms and institutions of the denomination. Southern was the mother seminary and is the crown jewel. Southern was last for a lot of reasons, had a huge board, they had longer terms, took longer for conservatives to get control. And when they did get control, they wanted to make it count. And when they asked me in the search process, "What would you do?" I told them what I would do. And they evidently wanted that done. And
you told them you would really change the faculty? Or?
I told them exactly what would be necessary. I said, you can't bring reformation and leave everything in place. You're going to have a clear understanding of what the confessional identity of the school is, and you're going to have to make it stick. And that means not only in hiring, that means, institutions drift left. That's a Genesis 3 reality. They never drift right. And if truth is the principle, then you can't say, okay, then we can accept, 45% heresy as a way of getting towards 35% heresy. You've got to say, if a confession states the truth of what we expect, every professor signs to teach in accordance with and not contrary to all that is contained therein. As you know, Protestantism learned this the hard way in the very beginning with Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and others, and especially in the English-speaking tradition. The Puritans learned this very quickly, how fast you lose academic institutions. Yeah. And obviously in the United States, another horrifying example. They were willing to do something radical because they knew something radical needed to be done.
So the theological liberals refer to it as a purge that you did.
Yes.
Do you accept that terminology?
Oh, well, it's not the first word I would use, but it is an accurate word. Nearly the entire faculty of one of the largest theological institutions on the planet was replaced within a 4 to 5 year period.
Okay, but was replaced a rare passive use by you? Basically, you replaced them.
Yes, I replaced them. I own that as my responsibility. That's why I was hired. And that's what I did.
And they didn't have tenure, so you could do that.
They did have tenure.
They did have tenure.
They did have tenure. It is a horrible misconception that tenure itself is the problem. Will is the problem. The tenure policy at Southern said that persons could be removed for teaching that which was not in accordance with and was contrary to the abstract of principles, the confession of faith. And I simply made very clear that's what we're going to do. Now, it required a heresy trial. It required due process. It required all kinds of documentation. It required an adversarial hearing, like a court proceeding. It turned out that not one of the faculty members was willing to endure that, so they surrendered.
None, zero. You didn't have to do any of that, or?
We came right up to the threshold more than once. But as it turned out, I'll be honest, I think those faculty members recognized, because trustees would have the majority of the jury, that they didn't have a chance. Because they were. With the truth on your side, you got a lot of confidence. If you are teaching in accordance with and not contrary to the confession of faith, then you're fine. But if you're teaching contrary to the confession of faith, that's all that's necessary to eliminate tenure. And so they resigned.
Right. And it took a lot of guts to do that, I suspect. Even with the board, the trustees in back of you still, you knew that you were going to be attacked as Ming the Merciless or something like that from Flash Gordon.
Well, yeah, just look at historians are already writing this history, and the verdict's already out there, coming from the academic left. And I'm so thankful for a board of trustees that was behind me, but nobody lists their names in the indictment of and they went home, and I was stuck there. I was not alone. I could not have done this without my wife, Mary, who was as committed to this as was I, and was with me all the way. So it's not true that I was alone, but it is true that we were alone.
Any other examples of that happening in American academia?
Almost none. There is one precursor to what happened in the SBC, but it's in a very small denomination, and that's the Missouri Synod Lutherans. And their seminary, especially Concordia in St. Louis, they also had a conservative redirection that took place in their denomination about a decade ahead of the SBC, but that's a very small denomination. Nobody thought that was indicative of what might happen in other denominations, or certainly anything as large as the Southern Baptist Convention.
Well, talking about the verdict of history, or at least the verdict of journalism, a sweet young lady, Molly Worthen,
Yes.
who can write in acid, as opposed
Yes.
to her demeanor, which is very sweet. Her writing tends to be pretty hard-hitting. So she, of course, has written about you and talked about the purge and so forth. But then she also had some details in it that I thought were very curious in a way. That she specified that at your home you have an enormous painting of Franz Joseph, the Habsburg emperor.
I do.
And she says, why a Southern Baptist would favor the company of an Anglican schemer, namely William Cecil, Queen Elizabeth's advisor, and a Catholic autocrat is not entirely clear. So why do you have an enormous painting of Franz Joseph?
I love history. I am fascinated with several epochs of history. William Cecil being Elizabeth I's longest serving minister, the first Lord Chancellor of Cambridge University. Fascinating figure. Anyone who collects art, you don't walk into a gallery and look at pictures of all your heroes and choose one. You walk into a gallery and there's a painting of William Cecil. Right. And I bought the painting of William Cecil. I loved having an Elizabethan portrait. And then the picture of Franz Joseph I bought because I love military history, and it's a version of a Winterthaler, if you know the history of that art. You look at it, it's a beautiful painting of a man in full. And so she can read whatever she wants to read into it. But I don't apologize for loving military history. And by the way, finding the Habsburgs fascinating. You can't talk about the world as we know it today without talking about the Habsburg Empire and its demise.
Yeah, and an empire of great diversity.
An empire that worked until it didn't.
Yeah. And she says that you have a shrine to Winston Churchill.
No, admittedly. I've had a fascination with Winston Churchill since I forgot you put all that in there, since I was 13. I mentioned this on the briefing not long ago because of the 50th anniversary of Churchill's funeral, which was the 30th of January. In the 8th grade, a teacher said, in fact, the teacher I mentioned, the atheist, he said, you're going to have to write an essay on a historical figure. I don't know what popped into my head. He said, you have like a week to think about it. I just went up and said, I'm going to write on Winston Churchill. He said, fine, wrote it down. I really didn't know much about him, but he's been a fascination to me ever since. And she could call it a shrine, but yes, I have probably 600 to 700 books by and about Churchill, 2 oil portraits of Churchill, lots of Churchill material, and
so
she can call it a shrine.
So he was willing to be roundly attacked, mocked, and so forth. So anyway, is that what it takes to be basically a stand-up evangelical in American culture today, a willingness to be mocked and ridiculed and attacked?
You know, Churchill he was not a theologically defined a believer and I'm pretty satisfied of that, but he was entirely committed to what we would call a Christian worldview, as was so often the case in the British upper classes at the time. He was absolutely convinced of being vindicated by history. He was absolutely convinced that what he believed was true and right, and eventually it would be seen as such, and he was willing to die without that yet having been seen. Yeah. And of course, the twists and turns in his career meant that, you know, you have the most fruitful period of his life intellectually were those wilderness years before all of a sudden he's returned to influence and becomes the prime minister who is credited with saving Western civilization, then's kicked out of office only to come back later. Yeah. And I take a lot of strength from him. I walk through my life with certain, you remember the name Elton Trueblood, Quaker theologian. I got to know him when I was very young, and he said he was speaking to a young man, he said every young man needs a perpetual vision of greatness. You need certain mentors you're going to walk through with life. And Luther has been one for me, and Churchill has been one for me, and I think that would be a fascinating conversation if we could get the two of them together.
Yeah, it would be. Thinking of mockery, issues on which evangelicals take stands and are attacked for it. Abortion, certainly, but typically when we're attacked on abortion, we're going to be looked upon by people on the other side as wrong, perhaps oppressing women, although not unborn baby women. Right. But we're not going to be considered necessarily stupid.
Right.
Now, the issue in which we're considered stupid, of course, is evolution.
Yes.
And let me ask a direct question. I'll ask you to role play for a minute. If you are a Republican candidate for president, not president of Southern Seminary, president of the United States, and a reporter, let's say hypothetically a London reporter just out of the blue says, what's your position on evolution? How would you respond to that? And again, not as you, well known for that, but as a politician who desires to be elected president of the United States.
I think the candidate who was asked that and didn't answer, instead punted. Would have been well served as a politician to say, you know, I am serving in a political office. I'm not seeking tenure in a science department at a university. So I will not engage that issue in the way you might expect, but other than to say, I am fully supportive of modern science and the modern scientific method, but I also have great respect for the millions of Americans who clearly believe in the divine creation of the world. And I will let the scientists and the theologians argue about this, and I will seek to be a good governor of the state of Wisconsin. That's not what he said. And I'm just offering political advice. I think punting on a question is unmanly and unfruitful. It's not going to work. But if you ask me as Al Mohler, I'm going to give you a very different answer. Right.
And why don't you briefly give everyone, and then we'll turn to your questions. Why don't you briefly give us that answer as Al Mohler?
Yeah, I don't think there is a more fundamental question. Because when you look at the worldview of Darwinism, and by that I don't just mean Darwin, I mean the modern Darwinian synthesis. There is no worldview that is at greater odds with that of Christianity, certainly biblical Christianity. They are two incompatible worldviews. Now, I say that because I spend a lot of time coming to understand the current Darwinian synthesis. And that excludes a lot of opportunities or alternatives that some evangelicals would like to suggest. I mean, for instance, Forbes magazine had an article that came out Sunday morning in which I was attacked on this issue, as if Forbes cares, I guess, but they evidently did. And the person writing the article said, Catholicism's made peace with evolution. Lots of evangelicals have made peace with evolution. Why won't someone like the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary make peace with evolution? And that's where I just want to be intellectually honest. Here's the Pope's position on evolution. If you actually look at the Pope's position on evolution, Pius XI, and then Benedict XVI, John Paul II, right down to Francis, their position is, as is seen in the official encyclical, is this: the Catholic Church has no conflict with evolution so long as evolution is respectful of the theological claims of the Roman Catholic Church. Well, I have no trouble with evolution so long as it's respectful of Genesis 1-2 all the way to Revelation and the end of Scripture. So if I can define evolution in that way, for instance, the Pope specifically said, Pius and Benedict came back and said this just recently when he was reigning as Pope, came back and said there has to be an historical Adam and an historical Eve, and every single human being has to be descended directly from them. There is no one, as you know, who represents the current state of Darwinism who would do anything but laugh at that proposal. So again, and there are a lot of evangelicals who are looking for some middle ground, some theistic evolution or whatever, but you don't have a gospel without an historical Adam. Mm-hmm. Because Christ himself is the second Adam, and Paul grounds his argument in that. You don't have common humanity without a common ancestry in Adam. And so I could go on this for far too long, but there are a lot of questions to be addressed here. But at the most foundational level, you can't have the modern Darwinian synthesis and anything like biblical Christianity. Because the current Darwinian synthesis says there can be no outside influence, there can be no design, it has to be entirely a naturalistic accident. Well, there can't be a statement at greater odds with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, all things are made. I mean, that it's a head-on collision.
Well, and the evangelical group that is desperately searching for a middle ground and promoting it certainly in lots of churches is the Biologos Foundation. Right. Have those folks ever invited you to one of their conferences for a debate or discussion?
To my knowledge, no. I certainly am not aware of that, although we've engaged each other publicly kind of across the blogosphere, certainly. And in their books, Carl Giberson, for instance, in his book pretty significantly. But here's what's interesting in that John Farrell piece that appeared at Forbes on Sunday. Even though they go at me, in the next paragraph, he's at least honest to say, even those evangelicals, such as Biologos, who say they're at peace with evolution, blanch, that was his term, his verb, at the true theological implications of what Darwinism would require. Exactly.
Okay. Blanch, it's a good word.
Yeah.
Any of you out there have good words, questions to ask?
Dr. Mohler, how should Christians think and react, or evangelicals in particular, about Islam and the rise of Islam? I know there was an article by Wood a couple of weeks ago that you probably read that seems helpful, but what's your response to that?
Yeah, I think we're watching a parable of the secular world and the secular worldview. As I said not too long ago, the secular elites are trying to bring a secular argument to a theological challenge. It's I serve around a lot of Texans. Don't bring a knife to a gunfight. There is no secular argument that has any kind of traction over against something of the theological vigor of Islam. And then you have a theological amnesia, is even worse than that. You have a denial of the fact that theological issues or truth claims can have public significance in the secular elites. They don't know what to do. They can't explain why 15-year-old girls are leaving London in a middle-class existence and becoming jihadi wives. They have no explanation of this. And we as Christians do. Because we understand as creatures made in God's image, we are inescapably, irreducibly theological creatures. And we understand that the strongest adherence is going to go to the strongest versions of theology. And that's why Islam has been from the beginning perhaps the greatest global challenge to Christianity. And this is a change in our mentality, because for a long time, evangelicals thought that Western secularism was going to be the main intellectual competitor, the main missiological challenge. And that has not gone away. But it is clear that for decades, maybe centuries to come, if the Lord tarries, that Islam is going to be the major challenge. It can only be challenged at a theological level. It can only be challenged at the level of who God is and how he has shown himself to us and what he expects of us. The Christian worldview that begins with answering the question, where did the world come from and where did I come from, and then goes to what's wrong with the world, and then the gospel is the answer to what can happen, and then the eschatology is the understanding of where history is headed. You can't, the secular elites are just disabled. They're intellectually, voluntarily disarmed from dealing with this. And the Graham Wood article in The Atlantic you mentioned is a profoundly important piece as a counter answer to that. And here you have someone who's saying, this is clearly theological. And not only that, the people who study Islam, and he cites a professor at Princeton in particular, they've been saying for years, this is quintessential Islam. And then, there is a turning point, I think, that's now being reached. I think the horrors of terrorism are beginning to capture attention. The Wall Street Journal over the weekend pointed out that the French Socialist Party is now saying this is a theological issue, which they didn't think could happen before. Roger Cohen, writing in the New York Times just in recent days, has said, look, it's about time we admit this is a theological challenge. Well, the bottom line is the secular world has no answer to a theological challenge. You can only meet a theological challenge with a more adequate theology, for lack of a better way of putting it, a truer theology. And that's where gospel-minded Christians have to remember that the gospel is, at the end of the day, as the Apostle Paul makes very clear in Ephesians chapter 6, all we've got with which to fight the great conflict of this age, and all we need. But there will be horrible, horrible conflicts. And, it is true. I think it's very important. It's true to say we are not at war with Islam, if that means being at war with every single Muslim. Let's be thankful that is not the case. We are at war with millions of people whose understanding of Islam goes right back to the founding of Islam, and they know it goes right back to the founding of Islam, and they are willing to live and die and more for the sake of that theology.
Back over there.
Dr. Mohler, some people are suggesting that the term culture wars isn't necessarily a really good metaphor for how Christians should engage the culture in these days. Do you think that it's still a good metaphor? And if not, what would you suggest would be a good replacement for that?
Yeah, this is a brilliant question about the culture wars. And I can remember when the term first started coming out, it was kind of framed in its essence by James Davison Hunter in a book by that title. The word had been used before, the term, but he really gave it cultural cachet and traction. And he's backed off of it, and a lot of people have backed off of it. The problem is the issues are still there, and if anything, the issues are more stark. The reason why the culture war may not fit so well is simply because there's a sense in which we had it and we lost. So there's a sense of, there's almost a sense of hope invested in that, especially from conservative Christians, that I think is probably lacking now. I'm old enough, I was in the room in 1977 when in some ways the new religious right was born. No one knew that's what it was going to be, but it was a pushback led by a woman by the name of Anita Bryant, actually, to a gay rights ordinance that had been passed in 1977 to 1978 by the Miami-Dade County Commission. It was overturned by action, by voter action in Miami. The first big gay rights ordinance in America was overturned by conservative Christians and by people who were cultural Christians and people who were just thinking, we're not ready for this. Look, the issues, the divide is deeper. You take the current issues of sexuality and marriage, the divide is deeper. The antagonisms across the cultural lines are greater. But we are not in a situation, I think honesty compels me to say, in which many of us believe that we're about to win a great referendum on these issues. And so to that degree, some of the tactical approach undertaken by both cultural conservatives and Christians in this country is going to change. But the culture war isn't over because there was some kind of truce. The culture war, if it's over, is because the secular left is in control of even more of the culture and its shaping influences. By the way, excuse me, if I could say one other thing. Some Christians were too belligerent, and we're not framing good arguments. And so some of the things that were done in the name of the culture war are things that we should repent of and not seek to emulate. But in terms of standing for what we know we have to stand for, in terms of conviction, not just because we believe it to be true, but because as Christians we believe that's what leads to human flourishing, we have no option to back off of those. You know, I don't know that I have a better metaphor other than the fact that I come back to 1 Peter, where I'm reminded that we are aliens and exiles in one sense. And so we are never to believe that we're going to be finally at home here. But as long as we are here, as Peter says, let your conduct among the Gentiles be such that even when they bring charge against you, they glorify the Lord Jesus Christ. We have no choice but to be faithful. And we have to recalibrate our aims. That's not entirely bad. We have to recalibrate our aims in a way that best fits a biblical vision of reality.
Dr. Mohler, I'm curious, what is your greatest concern for the local church these days? And what's Southern doing to help or assist or combat that?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I would simply say, I think my first concern for the local church will be the same as my mentor I cited earlier, Martin Luther. You know, the reformers had to quickly answer the question, where's the church? And Luther, you know, famously said, very early on, he said, the church is where the word of God is rightly preached and the sacraments, or I would say the ordinance, is rightly administered. And then he said, it all starts with the first mark, where the word of God is rightly preached. That is the one thing that must happen. And my greatest fear is that that's the one thing that won't happen. I can't remember who said this. Marvin, you probably will come up with this immediately. Was it Twain or someone like that who said there's no happier creature on earth than a writer not writing? It was someone like that. And I sometimes think there's no happier critter on earth than some preachers not preaching. In the sense that my great fear is that they will decide to do something other than preach the word in season and out of season, do it faithfully and do it well, do it lovingly and do it courageously. And so that is, I think, if you have a Reformation model of the church, which we hope is the New Testament model of the church, as Paul said to Timothy, whatever you do in season and out of season, the one thing you have to do is to preach the word. And let the word do its work, as Luther said. You remember Luther explained the Reformation in Wittenberg by saying, I preached and then I went to sleep, and while I slept, the Lord did this thing. So you have to trust the Lord's going to do this thing.
My favorite Twain statement is, life is too short to learn German. And if
Achtung.
And if more 19th century American theologians had followed Twain's advice, we would have been spared some of the higher criticism.
Absolutely,
So,
absolutely.
Yeah. Let's see, over here.
Yeah, well, in recent years, especially with the debate over gay rights and gay marriage becoming more prominent in debate, there have been a lot of people, liberals and conservatives, that have started wondering why the government is involved in marriage at all, and why they're being able to be the final arbiter in such a personal and emotional issue. And I understand you've said a couple words on this in the past, and I was wondering what your position was on this still.
No, it's fascinating you'd ask the question, because we're asking questions we've never asked before. We just took so much for granted. We just assumed that what the church said marriage is, the state's going to say marriage is. We didn't have to worry about it. It made perfect sense for a pastor to get up at the end of the ceremony and say, by the authority vested in me, by the state of X, I pronounce you man and wife. And so long as you have a fairly unified culture, you don't have to worry about that. The interesting thing is that in Western history, marriage, well, in fact, almost everywhere, but let's just speak of Western history, marriage has always been a function of the state, even when it wasn't a function of the church. For instance, in the Puritan settlements in what became America, in those Puritan settlements, by and large, marriage was only a civic reality. The idea of a church wedding was something they wrote off to Anglican pomp and Catholic circumstance. They didn't consider marriage to be a sacrament. They considered marriage to be a civil right that the church respected and a matter of biblical law that was to be honored. So the idea that we now have these Protestant weddings, that has a lot to do with developments that into more Protestant traditions that came from the Church of England, for instance, and from especially the Book of Common Prayer, where we've got all these people who are basically using an Anglican document without knowing it, right down to the vowels most often used. The state can't avoid defining what marriage is because of some of the state's functions. For instance, not just in tax law, but in property, and especially in children. In the history of Western law, one of the issues that has been most crucial for the definition of marriage is determining to whom these children belong, and how they are to be understood, especially even in terms of breakdown of marriage or the death of a parent, all these issues. The government's never going to back out of the marriage business, because even now with this moral revolution and the redefinition of marriage, the states are still, even if like the governor of Virginia has requested, we take out man and woman, husband and wife, and get that out of all the documents, and I guess it's partner one and partner two, or spouse and spouse, or whatever. Even then, the state's going to have to say, in terms of inheritance law, in terms of tax law, in terms of child custody cases, in terms of any number of issues, what marriage is going to look like. But your question points to the fact that we're in the unusual position for us of understanding that our definition of marriage and the state's definition of marriage is not going to be the same definition of marriage. And so we're in the awkward position of knowing that we're going to say that certain people, we believe, not just in terms of the church's, we believe that ontologically they're not married, but legally they may be. And I think there's going to be a broadening divide between the state's definition and the church's definition, and between ceremony and ceremony. And in the journal First Things in recent months, there's been a debate among very theologically serious-minded people who are committed to marriage as to whether it is allowable theologically for a Christian pastor to say, in the name of the state, I hereby marry. That's a debate that will not remain confined to the pages of a theological journal. It's going to end up being elders' meetings, deacons' meetings, and congregational meetings in short order.
Dr. Mohler, you had mentioned when you were younger, when you went to Broward County and really had that crisis of faith, that it was helpful for people to take your questions and help you go through things.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, in the last couple of years, there's been somewhat of an upheaval in especially the conservative homeschooling evangelical movement. We're seeing a lot of folks coming out of that who are kind of have had that crisis of faith. And just wondering, what's your word to them right now? And also maybe words to those who would help them as they go through that crisis.
Yeah, no, I love the question, and I'm going to use two unorthodox sources to cite here. One of them is one of the most profound philosophers of the Western tradition, and that's Soren Kierkegaard. If you follow Soren Kierkegaard's thought to its conclusion and his worldview to its end, you're going to abandon the gospel. You may even abandon the very existence of truth. But the one thing that Kierkegaard did understand was that to be an adult was to have an intellectual crisis. And that's one of the things I just want to say to young people. To be an adult is to have an intellectual crisis. If you haven't had an intellectual crisis, you're really not an adult. Because you've got to all of a sudden realize, now wait just a minute, I do not believe this merely because my grandmother did. That's not going to work. And I never really confronted strong arguments against what I was raised to believe, and now I do. I want to help give evangelical Christians the confidence to know we really do stand on a superior truth claim. We are really standing in a tradition of truth and truthful confession and of truthful argument in which we can handle these things. I mean, my background in terms of my doctoral work is systematic and historical theology. And that probably made me more an apologist than when I was actually studying apologetics, because I walked through. There's Athanasius and Arius. Here's Augustine and Pelagius. These arguments were responded to, or the early Christian apologists with the skeptics. We're not new to these questions, and we don't need to have a heart attack. An intellectual crisis is when you all of a sudden realize, all right, I'm going to have to figure out who I am and what I believe. And my hope and prayer is that when that happens, Christian young people are surrounded by intelligent, broad-minded, happy-to-talk Christians. The second person I'm going to quote, who's even more unorthodox than Soren Kierkegaard, is Oliver Wendell Holmes, who made the statement about simplicity and complexity. He said there are two kinds of simplicity, and I just have to tell you, I hang on this in a lot of my life. He said there are two kinds of simplicity. There's the simplicity on the near side of complexity, and there's the simplicity on the far side of complexity. And he said that second simplicity is the greatest thing. In other words, there is a simplicity that simply doesn't even seem to have any awareness that there are other worldviews out there, that there are other truth claims out there, that people disagree with us, and that there are some pretty strong arguments against us, okay? Now, if I thought they were compelling arguments, I'd join them. But, you know, those who are, whether it's the new atheists or the old atheists, I mean, heretics would not be a problem if they didn't make arguments somebody found compelling. And so there is a simplicity, which we all know, you know, when you're 9 years old and you ask your mom and dad a question, they give you the answer, and they show you a verse in the Bible, and you go to sleep at night with untroubled heart. Doesn't work quite the same way when you're 25. We have to go through that complexity. The problem is if we get mired in that complexity. And I think we have the models in the New Testament of what it means to move through that complexity, end up with what Holmes talked about, the simplicity on the far side of complexity, where we realize, I really do believe this. I believe the Christian worldview is truer than true. I believe it offers the most plausible understanding of the world as I know it, and even more, what I wouldn't know had I not come to know there is a God who speaks, as Francis Schaeffer said. And so I want that simplicity on the far side of complexity. And I want to say to someone mired in complexity, that's not the worst place to be. It's just not the place you want to stay. But you don't just jump out of it, you have to think out of it. And that's where I believe in the gospel, I believe in the Lordship of Christ, I believe in the Holy Spirit. I believe in the communion of the saints. I believe the church ought to be a place where someone who comes with that complexity is told to draw up a chair and have a cup of coffee because we got a lot to talk about.
So there are near-side Christians and there are far-side Christians.
Yes.
And the goal of a seminary is to help a person be a far-side Christian.
That's right.
Because in the middle, all you have are dead armadillo Christians. No.
Okay, we were raised in the 90s on the same cartoons. All I'd simply have to say is when I was reading the Chronicle of Higher Education back during the 1990s, and I had a horrible deficit in my life of cartoons, I actually thought that the strangest bestseller on the college campus was entitled Calvin and Hobbes, because I couldn't imagine who could write a bestseller about John Calvin and Thomas Hobbes. Then I became a believer.
Back over there.
Thank you so much for being here. Your response, I hope it's okay if we back up a moment, back to your response to Dr. Stillers. You had mentioned that the response to the, oh no, we seem to be losing, is that it's okay, we're aliens, this is not our home. But John Stonestreet was here yesterday, and his response to a similar question was, no, it's okay, we have home field advantage. We're not playing an away game. This is God's world. So basically I take that to mean in a sense that yes, this is our home. It's God's world. And so can those two views be reconciled in some way, or is this going to remain a disagreement based on one's view of dispensationalism?
Wow. It turns out to be a curveball at the very end. Brilliantly asked. Number one, I already agree with John. So can these two things be true? Yes, they can be true. And so there you have to look at some of the great minds of the Christian faith, and I would mention three: Augustine, Calvin, and Edwards. Because all three of them, John Calvin, and before him Augustine, and Jonathan Edwards, understood both of these things. We are not of this world, but we are in this world, and it makes a huge difference. I mean, Edwards died because he believed in this world so much that he believed in the rationality of the world, God's glory in it, and such that a vaccine, he believed, was a sign of how men committed to God's glory were understanding the universe in a way, and they gave him not too little but too much smallpox vaccination, and he died. As the president of what we now know as Princeton University, I mean, he was ready to conquer where he could, but understood he would die and have to trust it all to Christ. Calvin explicitly said that, and then Augustine's model of the two cities is where I live, and in my book Culture Shift, I mean, I don't think the Christian intellectual tradition has improved upon Augustine's understanding of the two cities, the city of God and the city of man. We are resident in both these cities. God's glory is in both of these cities, but God's glory is temporarily in the city of man. It is permanently and infinitely in the city of God. And the church exists in both of these cities to make a difference, but only one of them is eternal. And the city, the people of God can be defeated at least in the short term, can be defeated for centuries, can be defeated and even chased out of territory in the city of man, but not in the city of God. But there's not a call for retreat, and that's why the exile language, it isn't something that means we don't try to make a difference, and we don't see that there are real cultural gains that can be made. But it does mean that we alone have a theology for how that can be wiped out for a time, for a generation, in a place, and we don't lose the faith.
I'm going to be going soon to Lake Wales, Florida, not far from where you grew up.
Absolutely.
Which has been, I've been told that this is still a town that's like the town you grew up in. I don't know if that's true, but I'll see that.
Somewhat.
And then comparing that, I'll be going to San Francisco.
Yeah.
So a tale of two very different cities.
Yeah.
Do Christians have to speak differently in Lake Wales, in San Francisco, compared to Lake Wales?
Well, we have to have a different language, and here again, I think Augustine is a great help to us here. For one thing, in terms of communication, as you're better equipped than I to explain, you have to at least be able to communicate to people in the means of and the ability of their ability to receive that communication. We don't talk to a 4-year-old the way we talk to a 40-year-old, and we don't speak to someone who's just arrived from Poland not speaking English as if we're talking to someone that speaks English. Translation's always important. And the categories, if you walk into Lake Wales, my father's now gone to be with the Lord, but my mom still has a lake house in Lake Wales, which has lakes, including a lake called Lake Wales. It is not the same as it was when I was 13, but there are parts of it that are, and you can walk in, you can use what Southern Baptists call the language of Zion. You can use the language of historic evangelical Christianity, and a lot of people are going to know exactly what you're talking about. But if you go to San Francisco, when you use the word grace, it is not going to be understood as what you mean. In the most simple categories, even truth. I can still remember in the early 90s, the first time that I found myself in an intellectual context. It happened to be one of the Ivy League universities where I was talking about an issue and using the word truth and realizing that this wasn't just kind of the postmodern turn. I was talking to someone who understood truth to be something utterly different than what I was talking about, even as a word. So they heard me in expressivist terms. I was speaking in ontological terms, and I realized, okay, we're going to have to back off of this. So I'm glad you're going to Lake Wales. It'll be warmer than here.
Well, and on that note, I think we have to conclude for today, but please join me in thanking Dr. Al Mohler.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.